The last few subsections of this part on defining your own functions are finer points that you might skip on the first pass through. But here we go. Functions are important for splitting up work into logical and manageable pieces, which may be shared among multiple programmers. And it's useful to think of programmers as being in two roles. A programmer can be a user of a function written by somebody else or written into Python. They need to know certain things. They need to know the name of the function. They certainly need to know the order and meaning of the parameters. And they need to know what the thing does, what's returned, what's produced by the function. Now, how this is accomplished is not relevant to the user. You don't need to know how the Python development team makes the various built-in functions work. You just need to know that what they're supposed to end up doing. On the other hand, when you write a function, you need to know all about the variables and how they interact inside your function, as well as whatever you finally return. Now think if somebody else is writing a function that you're going to be a user of. If the names they give to variables inside of their function can be affected by you writing other functions, then it's going to cause problems. You don't want to have to know that stuff. And in fact, Python separates this with the concept of local scope. Separator is a variable that's first defined inside this function. Actually, the formal parameters are similar. The particular names that were given are just given inside the definition of the function. These three variables in this case all have local scope. Oh, same with result. That means that they are invisible outside of this function. And also, when the function terminates, they all completely lose their meaning and their value. They're just used temporarily inside this definition. That means that if somebody else has a variable called result in their function, which they then say return, it's not going to affect the variable that you've named result. That's a very important principle. Now, it's easy to make problems with scope to get things wrong. So let's look at this example, which has an error. So we define a main program where we set x to be equal to 3, and we call the function f. Inside the function f, it says to print x. Well, of course, we defined x up here, but it was not in the same function. This function doesn't know anything about the local variables up in the main function. So this will be an error. I've loaded this bad scope function into Python, and we can quick run it, and you see we get this error. It says global name x is not defined. This is in line 8. And again, this is here, and it doesn't know what to do with x. If you want to have data that's in one function visible to another function, the most obvious way to do it is to pass it as a parameter. Here's a variation on this program. Sure, I can set x equal to 3, but if I want the value of x to get to a function that I call, it makes sense for this to be a parameter to the function. So the new f has x as a parameter, and then of course it can print it. One other fine point here, the x here is actually a local variable, so I could use any name. It doesn't have to match the x up here. The function could just be defined like here, f of whatever and print whatever. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that the value of x is being passed to this function and then can be used. There is one place where you're encouraged to define variables outside of any function. They're called global variables, but the version that you're most encouraged to use would be global constants. Anything that's defined outside of functions is available to be read inside all of the functions, but it's a good convention that the only things you define out here are constants, that things that are going to be defined and then read and used but never changed. There's another convention to put capital letter names for here. So here, for instance, I define pi as this long decimal number, and then I've got several functions here having to do with circles that then use pi, and that's fine.